Today's ship chat is at the request of Mr. Jean-Luc Martel, one of my members. If you have a request for a ship chat or other episode, then by becoming a member, your request may be given greater consideration. Consider clicking that join button today. Thank you very much. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Nimitz class from Star Trek Discovery. Now, if you have any opinions on Star Trek Discovery, keep them to yourself. No one wants to hear them here. We've heard it all a million times. It's all been done to death. And frankly, I've had enough of all the negativity. And frankly, it's got nothing to do with the Nimitz. I think it's a little unfair on these ships there. Some of them are quite strong on their own. So, like I say, if you've got any opinions on Discovery in general, this isn't the place for them. In real life, it was actually designed by John Eaves, which is why it and many of the other Federation designs are so solid. They somewhat fit the era. It's debatable, but they're certainly not egregious and very striking designs in their own right. Now, I should briefly mention that there is the issue of size and scaling. The original class is scaled in the show officially at 383 meters, which is even that not too egregious, but if we reconcile the scales of Star Trek Discovery, because we have a Discovery Enterprise and the original Enterprise, you scale the Discovery Enterprise back down to the original Enterprise size, you get the scale factor of Star Trek Discovery, and so we can then scale things down to what they would really look like. With the Nimitz class, we get that down to 283 meters, which is far more reasonable. It's actually, while longer than a Miranda, it's considerably smaller than a Miranda, so it kind of makes sense that the Miranda is a successor. Obviously, the two classes have a lot in common, although that's somewhat surface level, but overall, you can see why the Miranda would replace it as a, bigger, beefier, more high-powered version. So that's really just its IRL history, a design, and how we can kind of then interpret it in universe and make it all fit nicely. So in universe, it was really developed as a response and recovery vessel. It's really worth mentioning that during the early Federation period, particularly in the early 23rd century, ships are exploring far and wide, but warp speeds have only increased incrementally since cracking Warp 5. They still haven't broken Warp 7, and as a result, with starships going ever further afield, help is often quite far away. So the Nimitz was really envisaged by Starfleet as something of a response package. If something went wrong, you encountered a hostile species, or you simply broke down, which with some of those reactors was not uncommon, then you would have a support package in the form of a Nimitz-class ship that could come to render aid. It was a very well-equipped ship for most situations. So the Nimitz really took the form of your primary response and recovery starship. And this also is why it has this very striking livery. Apart from the fact that a lot of the ships of the period do have the livery, the red signifies that it is part of the engineering division. So the Europa specifically would be part of the Starfleet Corps of Engineers, so they would be going out mostly on recovery missions to help ships that had broken down in deep space. Because it's worth remembering that during the 23rd century they weren't carrying around spare warp cores, and the things could be quite dicky at the best of times. In order to facilitate that response package, it has a quad nacelle design. Now, it's not the same as other quad nacelle ships, like the Cardenas and the Constellation, which both have all four nacelles in line of sight of each other, and this creates 4 warp fields. A warp field is generated anytime 2 nacelles see each other. Now, with the Nimitz, you actually only have 2 warp fields. Now, that's one more than on a standard twin nacelle design. But there's a very important reason for why that is. Apart from the fact that at this period, they still hadn't cracked how to power a full quad nacelle design because they obviously guzzle a lot more power, and that would even be a problem for the Constellation. Instead, what you actually have is actually you have two different warp modes. So you have the upper set of nacelles, which allow for a typical cruising speed. They're mounted at shallow angles, close to the ship's center of mass, and that gives them a strong warp field with tight geometry and allows it to cruise for a very long distance. The lower set allow it to have what is known as a pursuit mode, much like Klingon nacelles, which are all mounted below the ship's center of mass and further back. That imparts greater acceleration and agility for the ship. So if the Nimitz needs to respond to a crisis or is engaged at warp speed, it has that greater maneuverability and agility to call on. Now, it wouldn't be as strong as a ship specifically built for that purpose, but it preserves that dual mode option. It also means that they just have an extra set of engines for other uses in its support package role, such as warp speed towing is the most critical one. They were actually given new tractor beams, much more powerful, sustained tractor beams. Previously, tractor beams could only really be used for course correction of objects or shuttles or what have you, but with the new tractor beam system, it could be a continuous beam. And that, combined with the fact that you have effectively two warp fields at your command, means that the Nimitz was able to tow ships at warp back to starbases, and that was critical in its recovery role. It was also useful in just helping it move things at warp, such as large station components and what have you. So it was very handy in that regard and gave it a good degree of versatility and utility. And really, if anything, you just have a spare set of engines that are working. Now, as well as that, of course, the other half of its duties as a response package is its tactical aspects. It has 14 phaser batteries and 2 torpedo tubes, which is quite impressive of the time. But it's worth bearing in mind that these are mostly concentrated in the front arc, and like most quad nacelle ships, it doesn't have much of a rear firing arc, so it is quite vulnerable in that regard. It also, as part of its response package, has a huge shuttle bay at the back, and that does give it a lot of other versatility in terms of planetary exploration and just general utility and support, be it scientific, engineering, or tactical operations. So it's a very versatile ship and really packs quite a lot into quite a small package. Now, in terms of its actual service history, it was launched in the 2240s. And anyone who knows their history knows that, of course, that was the start of the 4 Years' War. And in terms of its use in the 4 Years' War, one-on-one, it was incredibly strong. Remember, the Klingons don't have the D7 yet. The best they have is a D6. And next to the D6, the Nimitz is a very imposing starship, capable of outgunning most Klingon ships one-on-one. Unfortunately, particularly in the early stages of the war, it would often be isolated. The Klingons still had greater maneuverability, and while yes, the Nimitz did have the pursuit engines, and that did allow it greater maneuverability and agility compared to Klingon ships that are built from the ground up to use that kind of warp geometry, it consistently lost out. And so, despite being very capable in a one-on-one, these never happened. It would always be a 3-on-1. And in that, the Nimitz really struggled, particularly with its rear blind spot. So really, during the war, it shows its true colours as a jack of all trades, but largely master of none. It's very handy as part of a fleet, but it was really the linchpin of the Federation fleet of the time, and when properly backed up, was incredibly formidable and made for a very good command ship. It was ultimately outmoded by high-performance classes such as the Lochnar and, of course, Constitution class, which boasted far better warp speeds and matched it in terms of tactical capabilities. It remained as part of the support fleet, continuing up until the late 2270s, where unfortunately it would be replaced by the Constellation class, which was a fully fledged quad nacelle ship with a reactor that could actually support it. In total, it only really saw about 30 years in service, which actually means it had a far shorter lifespan than an ancient Earth Nimitz class, which had almost 50 years in frontline service. I only replaced them in the 2020s. While it was very capable, it unfortunately got overshadowed by the technology race that really broke out during the 23rd century, but as a ship of its time, it was certainly very capable, and it's very telling of the time that it was built in, one where they were having to adapt to the fact that help suddenly wasn't around the corner, and was quite a ways away, which is quite a novel thought these days, that's for sure. But it definitely was a sight for sore eyes.